Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth annual Women's Business Leadership in Tech Conference. My name is Sanam Danoa. I am a member of the class of 2021 at Columbia Business School, and it is my pleasure to officially welcome my fellow students, faculty, staff, alumni, and other industry professionals to this event. Today, we will hear from alumna James Carter, a current PhD student here at Columbia Business School, where he researches barriers and pathways to diversity and inclusion at both the individual and organizational level, with a particular emphasis on discrimination, social identity, social hierarchy, and inequality. James will discuss insights from his exponential research regarding gender perceptions in relation to female-led tech ventures. As a reminder, attendees will have a chance to ask questions throughout the conversation via the Q&A box. So please submit your questions there, and I will return to address those questions following the presentation. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce James Carter.
Thank you so much, Sanam, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here and to share some research that I'm doing with Malia Mason, who is currently a professor in the management division here. That work is titled, "Do Salary History Bands Make Way for More Equitable Wages? Insights from Experimental Research." And so before I dive into sort of giving you the lay of the land and sharing my research findings, I do want to share an agenda so you have a sense of where I'm going to go. So first, I want to talk about sort of the background, like what are salary history bands? What do we know about them? Then I'm going to give you an overview of that research, as well as the research and the goals that my research team had in conducting the experiments that we did. I'll share some findings from that work, important implications from that work, and then conclude for time for questions. And so, like I said, I want to give a little bit of background. So what are salary history bands? And simply, an SHB is a blanket term for policies that prohibit employers from requesting salary history information from job applicants. Historically, it's been a common practice for employers or prospective employers to ask for job applicants' prior salary information. So whether this happens during the interview stage or once someone has already secured an offer, is a pretty commonplace practice. And so far, approximately 19 states, about 19 or 20 states, and about 21 localities and municipalities have implemented such a ban, with the idea that these bans would help reduce wage inequality between women and men. And so where did they come from? Where did this idea come from? They're a relatively new practice, at least sort of institutionally and legislatively. And so in 2019, Eileen Rizzo, who is pictured here, filed suit in California against her employer, which was a California school district, basically arguing that she was being paid less than a male counterpart who was hired after her and who was being paid significantly more. And so what's interesting about this case is that the school district did not disagree that she was being paid less, but instead argued that they based her salary on her previous salary from a different job. And so what the Ninth Circuit Court ruled was that an employer cannot use an employee's prior pay as justification for their current salary, as it's not job related, but also because it can carry the effects of sex-based pay discrimination. So they shouldn't rely on it because it's potentially discriminatory. Now, other circuit courts have sort of disagreed with this. And as recently as 2020, the Supreme Court has sort of passed the buck on sort of clarifying it and making it the law of the land, whether or not employers can use it. But we're in this space where some states have started to adopt it and others haven't. And so the logic behind them is relatively simple. So the legislation is intended to prevent a further widening of the gender pay gap. And the most cited statistic, which I'm sure has come up today and is probably pretty poignant or relevant in people's mind, is that women's earnings are about 81% of what the white male dollar is. And we also know from other research that this gap is even wider for women of color. And so because women tend to make less than men, the logic is that if employers are prevented from asking about prior salary, policies that prevent women from being forced to sort of reveal that information would protect them from being penalized for historically low wages. And so given that we know that these policies are relatively new, what is it that we know about SHBs so far? And so part of designing effective policy is that researchers and lawmakers and those charged with implementing those policies know exactly how they work. So again, the research is relatively limited, but economists have provided us with some insight on what SHBs have done so far. And so I'm going to give you a quick sort of drive-by of what the research says in this space. Interestingly, a lot of the findings are relatively ironic or sort of counterintuitive, which just means that more experimental and sort of tightly controlled research needs to be conducted. And so, for example, one study found that in weekly wages, the gender pay gap did decrease by about 4 percentage points, but that's only in the private sector. And interestingly, the gap in the public sector increased when these bans were implemented. And so in California, which was the first state to sort of adopt these policies, female earnings are increasing relative to male earnings. But again, this effect is relatively small. So this is about a 1% increase. Although it's not ideal, this is interesting work to come from one of the earliest adopters of these policies. And so other work has actually found that employees who don't comply with these bans, so they share their salary information regardless, can underwrite the overall effectiveness of these policies. So for example, you can imagine that men might not want to withhold their salary information if they are compensated particularly well. So if certain groups are non-compliant, that reduces the effectiveness of these policies. And lastly, and interestingly enough, because it'll come up again, other work shows that high-earning women can actually be particularly hurt by the loss of salary information. Because if people don't have that information, they could rely on stereotypes or expectations about what a woman should be paid for a job. They could then, that could then particularly diminish the wages offered to highly compensated women. And so there are other ironic sort of effects that we can glean from similar policies. So if you're familiar with ban the box policies restrict employers from asking applicants about their criminal histories. The idea here being that if someone has been incarcerated and served time, it's nice to not ask them about that experience because people will then discriminate and say, oh, we don't want to hire them for their criminal history reasons. So ideally, on its face, the ban the box policies sound great. But what research finds is that actually withholding criminal history decreases the rate of hiring, for example, for young Black men, because it actually increases statistical discrimination. So it increases the likelihood that people will rely on stereotypes about Black men, and that reduces their job prospects. So again, we're seeing some sort of ironic findings. On the other hand, there's policies in Denmark that actually require firms to provide disaggregated wage statistics. And so researchers find that in Denmark, they do see the pay gap actually close, which is great. But when you look at this chart, you can see that that's because of a decrease in male wages and not necessarily an increase in female wages. So while we're seeing the effect that we'd hope to see, we're not seeing the reason for that effect be what we want it to be. And so this is actually work done by Professor Wolfensohn, who is at Columbia Business School. But I did want to highlight him. This is not work that I did. This is his work. And so I just want to give a broad overview of the research that we conducted and share sort of the goals of that research to sort of orient you to the experiments that you'll see. And so our first goal was to provide some clarity on the effectiveness or lack thereof of salary history ban policies. Secondly, we wanted to examine whether women and men are differentially impacted by these policies. So again, if the logic is that the salaries should protect women, we want to see if there are actually differential experiences by gender. We also want to examine when and for whom salary history bans might backfire. As I mentioned, similar policies have seen these sort of ironic effects whereby they can hurt the people they're intended to support or intended to sort of give it an equal experience to. So we want to examine if that's a potential sort of drawback of a salary history ban policy as well. And we also want to examine if salary history bans affect candidates' behavior. And so research in psychology on anchoring and reference points suggests that making a number salient or particularly clear to someone allows them to then sort of anchor on that number and deviate or move sort of around it. And so if that's the case, that offer makers are doing that, it's logical to also assume that asking a candidate about their previous salary might also then lead them to anchoring on that number and to be less assertive in the counter offers that they make. And so we want to explore that question more directly. And so now just to give you an overview of the experiments you'll see, I'll be presenting 3 today. Experiment 1 addresses, do offer makers rely on prior salary when determining current salary? And if so, does that effect vary by gender? Experiment 2 addresses, in the absence of salary information, so now we're in a world where in some states, people can't ask, so what is it that they rely on? And we're suspecting they rely on the market and what that job is typically paid. And so what does this absence mean for high wage earners is also a question we need to answer in experiment 2. In experiment 3, the last experiment I'll present, asks, do salary history bands have the potential to shape both offer maker and offer recipient behavior? Exactly as I sort of explained on the other slide, if people are being anchored, it's reasonable to assume, if offer makers are being anchored, it's reasonable to assume that offer recipients might also be anchored on their low prior salaries. And so I'm only presenting these 3 experiments, but we've run a number of studies and we've replicated these effects across samples. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. But it's also important to note that the context here that we're looking at for experiments 1 and 2, and 3, the offer has already been made. So we're not in the interviewing stage, although experiment 3 does sort of oscillate between the interview and the offer, and the sort of offer receive stage. And I'll explain that a little bit when I get there. And so now I want to go over the findings from our 3 experiments. So experiment 1, again, the question here was, does prior salary matter? And so we conducted this study with 212 MBA students. We also conducted the study with 400 undergrads, and the results were the same, but I wanted to present this study to this audience. And so we told the participants, we say, imagine you're hiring a digital marketing account manager. Now we intentionally made this job vague because we didn't want people to have too much experience hiring this role or working in this role. We also tell them you've been authorized to pay your candidate of choice. We either tell them it's Tina or Tim to manipulate gender in this context, up to $140,000. But we also tell them that the going rate is between $80,000 and $100,000. We then also tell them that your candidate of choice either made $75,000 previously or $90,000 previously. The idea being that these numbers would mimic sort of a low salary in this context and a high salary in this context. And our dependent variable, the thing that we're interested in most, was how much money the participants would offer as a starting salary. And so before I explain the results, I do want to say a couple of things. So first, we actually don't see differences across gender. So Tim and Tina on average were offered the same salary. So we collapse our results across gender just to show the overall effect of high and low salary. And what is on the x-axis here, so low prior salaries on the left and high prior salaries on the right. And if our hypothesis is correct, we'd imagine that the high prior salary bar, so for people who made $90,000 previously, are being offered a higher salary than people who made $70,000 previously. And so that's exactly what we find. We find on average that people in the high prior salary condition are offered about $10,000 more than those in the low prior salary condition. Again, for the same job with the same parameters. And this difference is statistically significant. And so just to wrap up experiment 1, we find that low previous salaries can have an undermining effect if they're revealed, which was what we suspected we might find. And what's interesting is we even made it salient, or we made it particularly clear to participants that their job experience, that they had no experience in this role, and that their previous job was absolutely unrelated. And basically what we were getting at there was that they shouldn't use their previous salary as a signal of what they should be making in their current job. But we find that even doing that, the effect still comes out. And again, we didn't see any differences by gender, but it's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that women tend to have lower wages than men in general. And this point will come back up in later experiments. And so experiment 2, this asked, does the market rate matter? And so absent of information, how do people decide what compensation, how do offer makers decide what compensation to give to prospective employees? And so for this study, we recruited about 800 American adults. So we told them to imagine that they're hiring a loan officer at a local bank. So we manipulated a couple of things in this study. So we manipulated gender, but we didn't see gender effects, so I don't present it on this slide. But we also manipulated the going rate for this position. So we either told them that loan officers at this bank make between 40 and 45,000, or loan officers at this bank make between 55 and 60,000, or in this city, excuse me. We also tell them that the candidate that they selected, either Christina or Christopher, made either $40,000 in their previous job, $60,000 in their previous job, or we don't tell them any information about their previous salary. And again, our variable of interest here is how much would you offer Christina and Christopher as a starting salary? So as I mentioned, we don't see gender differences here either. They were offered about the same salary across the conditions. So we collapse the results and just show how our other manipulations sort of changed future salary and the salary that would be offered. And so first, I want to show you that on the y-axis, again, we have salary offered. And on the x-axis, we have the market range. So this is the range that we told them for the job. And what we expect to find is that the high market range bar would be higher, the bar on the left would be higher than the bar on the right, because again, they're learning that this job pays about 60,000 as opposed to the other, which pays about 40,000. And so that's exactly what we find. So we see this overall effect where the market range, when it was high, participants were offered a much higher salary than when it was low. Again, this is not necessarily surprising, but it supports our contention that offer makers are using the market rate to make salary offers, especially when they don't have salary information, which I'll talk about in a second. And so we were also interested in whether withholding salary information was better than revealing a low prior salary. And so again, sort of on the same chart, we have no information, no salary information provided on the left. And on the right, we have low prior salary revealed. And so what we'd expect to find again is that when people are not revealing their salary information or it's not being asked of them, that they fare better than when they have to reveal a low prior salary. And that's exactly what we find. So we find that offer makers offered higher wages overall when salary information is withheld than when people have to reveal that they made a low salary in the past. We then wanted to consider whether salary offers are bounded by both prior salary and market range. And this is where we see really interesting effects. So we actually find that a low prior salary was better than not revealing a prior salary when the market range is low, but not when it's high. So basically what we see is when the salary range is relatively low, no information is actually worse than low previous salary. Now, this is not what we expected to find, but it's an interesting sort of result to point out. On the other hand, we find that it's actually beneficial to withhold salary information when the market is high, as opposed to reveal that you made a low previous salary. Now, this is what we expected to find. We did expect that not having to reveal sort of a low previous salary would be better, especially when the job pays a lot. And so that's what we find with this result. And so just to conclude this experiment, offer makers do take into consideration what the market pays when they construct salary offers. We also find that offer makers rely on this information more when they don't know salary history. And another point to make is that job seekers do not uniformly benefit from a salary history ban. And so this is an interesting point to take away from this experiment, because basically what we find is that the benefit they derive, or the benefit that an employee or prospective employee would derive from a salary history ban, critically depends on how the current pay compares with their prior wage. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. And it speaks to sort of the complexities and the nuances of policies that sort of uniformly say, no, you can't do this, or yes, you can do this. And so moving to experiment 3, here we asked, do salary history bans shape both offer maker and offer recipient behavior? And so in this study, we had 616 American adults. We told them, imagine you're interviewing for a job as a digital content editor. So again, we changed the context in experiment 3 to reflect the sort of salary negotiation process. So here they're told they're interviewing. We tell them how much the job pays. It pays between 45 and 65,000. And then here's where we implement the manipulation. So half of the people are asked before they're told what the salary offered is. So the salary offer across the conditions is the same. So everyone was offered $40,000. Half the people, however, were asked to think about and report their previous job salary before they were told that they were being offered $40,000. And then the other half of participants were told to report their salary after they made a counteroffer. So basically, one group was keenly aware of what they previously made before they saw the salary that they were offered, and the other group was not. Our dependent variable in this context was how much would you counteroffer from this $40,000? And so there are a lot of interesting results to present here, but first I want to show that we find a pretty strong assertiveness gap. So we see that high wage earners respond with more assertive counteroffers than low wage earners. And so basically what this means is if you look along the x-axis, that's sort of previous salary, and on the y-axis, we have counteroffer. So as a participant's previous salary increased, so did the assertiveness with which they made a counteroffer. Most interestingly about this result is that we also find that prior salary had a larger effect if participants were asked before they made an offer as opposed to after. So again, making it clear that participants were thinking about their previous salary before they made a counteroffer was stronger than making them think about it after they made a counteroffer. And so just to unpack that a little bit, among participants who made less than the current position, so $40,000, those who were not asked about their wage after they counteroffered, countered with about $2,400 more than those who were asked during the negotiation. So basically what we see in this graph is that the people asked after they made their counteroffer tended to be a little more assertive and ask for more money, which is, again, what we suspected would happen, and it sort of suggests that the policy is helping low wage earners be a little bit more assertive. Now, on the flip side, what we see is among the people who made more than $40,000 in their prior work, those who were asked for that figure during the negotiation countered with about $4,400 more than those who were not asked. So basically, the other side of the graph we see after $40,000, if you had a high previous salary, you were a lot more assertive after the negotiation, during the negotiation as opposed to after the negotiation. Basically, being reminded that you made a lot of money impacted the assertiveness with which you made a counteroffer. And so what about gender? I mentioned in the first two studies, we actually didn't see any notable effects of gender. There are some interesting gender differences by some conditions, but I didn't have time to present those today, and I'm happy to talk about it offline. But overall, we didn't see any gender differences. However, in this experiment, we do find some interesting gender results. So we observed meaningful gender differences in recruit counteroffer behavior. So what we find is that women overall made significantly lower salary counteroffers than men. And so women, on average, asked for about $50,500 in a counteroffer, while men asked for about $53,000, so about a $2,500 difference. And now if you're thinking, like we were thinking when we ran this experiment, well, we said, well, the men in our sample probably reported higher salaries on average, higher previous salaries, and that was the case. So when we include a variable for that in our model, so we include prior salary in our model and control for it, we actually find that this this difference is even stronger and more robust. So this $2,500 number goes up to about $3,000. So we see that women are countering on average $3,000 less when we're controlling for previous salary. Now, that's a notable difference to make, but it also, again, suggests that it's not necessarily all about the policies that we enact with respect to salary history and whether we make it available or not, but also the extent to which we empower employees to be assertive and the extent to which women feel confident to be assertive, but also that men are accurate in the salaries that they counter with, right? Because there's one of two things could be happening, or both things could be happening. Women could be undervaluing their work and their value, and men could be overvaluing their work. And so just to conclude experiment 3, we find that, again, both offer makers and offer recipients are impacted by salary history bands. So simply asking recipients to think about their prior salary impacts their counteroffer behavior. And being asked about a low prior salary leads to less assertive counteroffers, which again is what we would expect. And because women are more likely to have lower prior salaries, we see that this effect actually tends to be compounded for them. And so what our pattern of results suggests is that low wage earners who are protected by a salary history band, again, feel more comfortable pushing back and asking for a higher salary. And by contrast, high wage earners actually feel more emboldened to ask for more when their salary history is known, as opposed to when it's not discussed. And so, great, James, you've presented a smattering of results? Like, what do we do with that and what's the takeaway? So now I want to discuss some of the implications. And so if you're a job candidate or an offer recipient, and there is a salary history band in place, it's important to know that and educate yourself on the specifics of the salary history band in your region. What I've seen in my research is that they're not all created equal. And even some cities have it as opposed to, the full state. So it's important to know exactly what you're getting into. It's equally important to know what the market range is for the job. Very familiar with Glassdoor and Indeed. They tend to provide sort of salary ranges, I think, as tight as like by city. So you can look and see what the range is for the job that you're transitioning to or thinking about moving into. And sort of knowing that going in can be incredibly helpful. And when there's not a salary history band in place, we know that you can also just reveal your salary information if you think it'd be beneficial. Nothing's preventing you from doing that. I did talk about compliance earlier, but again, if the idea is to increase equity and equitable compensation, particularly again for high wage women, it's important that you feel that you can really share that information so that you're paid what you're worth. Also, if you're asked about it, feel free to deflect away, especially if you felt you've been underpaid, right? So saying something like, I was comfortable with what I made in the past, but again, coming back to this market rate, I know that the job tends to pay between X and Y, and that's what I'm expecting to be paid. And similarly, have an aspiration point in mind and make that figure salient. So as I showed in experiment 3, when you think about an unfavorable reference point, that reduces the extent to which you're assertive on your counteroffer. If instead thinking and reflecting on your previous salary, you think and reflect on your aspiration point, that could potentially reduce that sort of gap that we observed in study 3. Now, on the flip side, if you're a recruiter or an offer maker and you're subjected to salary history bands, again, we're back to compliance, but comply with it, strive for fairness, right? The idea is that these policies are in place to help increase equity and reduce inequality. And so being compliant is important for that. And if you're not subjected to salary history bands, again, feel free to not ask. We know that some of these wages, particularly for women and for people of color, they already have some level of discrimination baked in. We know that jobs with high percentage of women who work in them are undervalued and tend to be paid less. And so if we can avoid that sort of route or that process as much as possible, that should be the goal. And so just to quickly conclude and sort of summarize what I've already said and shown you here, we find that offer maker behavior is shaped by offer recipients' prior salary when that information is available. And again, this is either for better or for worse. But we also know that when offer makers lack that information, they rely on the market rate, which tends to result in more equitable wages and offers to people seeking those jobs. We also have seen that salary history bands shape both offer maker and offer recipients' cognition and behavior. So there's this sort of dual anchoring effect whereby knowing that information as both an offer maker and a recipient can shape the offers and counter offers that people make. And although we didn't find consistent gender effects, this suggests that men and women are sort of equally affected by salary history bands. Again, like I said, there have been some instances where we've seen differences by gender, but nothing notable across the board. But it's nice to know that men and women are equally benefiting from these policies, especially the people who are in low wage jobs. And so I'll conclude my talk here, and I want to thank you for your time and attention. This is Malia Mason, my co-author, and our information is here on this slide if you would like to jot it down or email us questions or connect with us on Twitter. So with that, I'll end. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, James. That was really insightful and thought-provoking, I think, especially for some of us students who are going through the recruiting process. So I really appreciate it. And now I would like to take a moment to open up to questions. So if you haven't already, please add your questions to the Q&A box. And
stop sharing if that's helpful.
Great. And we'll start off with Karen. She said that I keep getting pushed by recruiters to inform them of my salary expectations, which I feel is similar to getting information on how much one is making in their past position. There isn't really a question here, but I guess, if you can maybe speak to that a little bit and if that kind of still qualifies as a salary history band.
So I think it's a great question. I think what what our research suggests, because we don't necessarily speak to salary expectations, but I think the idea around an aspiration point suggests that basically knowing that market rate can be powerful, right? So if someone's asking you about your salary expectations, that might be their way to sort of glean like what you are used to making, right, in your previous job. But again, if you're like, I was comfortable with my previous salary, but I know this job pays between X and Y, like those are my expectations, then that can sort of curb the let's see if we can try to circumvent asking about salary history by asking about expectation. So that would be my recommendation. But I do think that that's a great point to sort of mention that, yeah, there probably are going to be a number of ways that recruiters try to get around these policies, but being armed with your research and your information and your knowledge about the job, your personal expectations, your aspiration point, but also the market rate can be a powerful way to deter against that.
Absolutely. And then next from Michael, we have similar studies been done where the survey responders were experienced hiring managers or HR heads rather than college or MBA students? And if so, were the outcomes similar?
So that's a great question. So we've run this study with MBA students. We've run these studies, with MBA students, undergrads, and full-time working adults who have answered, like we've asked them questions like, have you had experience hiring individuals? And so in our analyses, we only include the people who have hiring experience, and we do find that the results are pretty consistent and they're incredibly robust. So I haven't seen any differences across my sample. So even the undergraduate samples mirror what I would call, full-time working adults with hiring experience. But I do think that's a good question. And I do imagine that there are nuances and differences between the levels of experience that people have with hiring and engaging with recruiters, but also with prospective employees. So that's a good question.
Great. And then from Gian, how can I efficiently find the local market rate for roles or positions? What sites, databases, or resources do you recommend? I know you mentioned Glassdoor, but is there any other resource out there that would be a good source?
Yes, so I say Glassdoor. So we actually consulted with Glassdoor to get the figures for some of our studies. We wanted them to be as ecologically valid, as realistic as possible. So Glassdoor is a good resource. There's also something called ONET, which I actually, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure it's open access or available to everyone. But as someone who's trained as an undergrad as an IO psychologist, ONET is this great resource where you can look at and look up by job all sorts of salaries, the job outlook, the job expectancy, the requirements for that job and things like that. So I would suggest Glassdoor, which tends to be a little more public facing, and then ONET, which tends to be a little bit more academic, but incredibly helpful, incredibly detailed.
That's great to know. Thank you. We'll wait a few more seconds to see if anyone has any additional questions. All right. Well, in that case, let's wrap up. Thank you all for attending. And I encourage everyone to head to the Air Meet to join the networking session presented by the Women's Circle. Thank you again very much, James. And we hope to see everyone next year for the 5th annual event.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day. Thanks for being here.